The evening air was thick with the perfume of old money and carefully maintained roses. Amara Bennett stepped out of the sleek black town car, her navy blue suit catching the last amber rays of a setting sun. The Harrove estate loomed ahead like something out of a European painting, sprawling, opulent, and suffocatingly pristine. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, the silk lining smooth against her wrists. A quiet, practiced inhale. This wasn't just another dinner. This was supposed to be a moment of history, the night when her tech empire merged with one of the oldest luxury dynasties in the country. A $500 million partnership. Legacy meets innovation. That's what the headlines were supposed to read. But headlines lie. She stepped through the open iron gates, the gravel crunching under her heels like whispers behind closed doors. A butler met her with a stiff nod. "Ms. Bennett, welcome to Harrove House." Inside, the chandelier sparkled like a sky full of judgmental stars. Murmured conversations and soft laughter echoed through the ballroom, draped in gold and ivory. Everyone turned. Everyone looked. Some with curiosity, some with calculation, and a few with something colder. Amara walked with her usual grace, confident, measured. She had earned this. Every step was forged by years of proving she belonged in rooms that had never imagined someone like her at the head of the table. The lawyer, a pale, nervous man named Gregory, ushered her toward the long dinner table. "We're honored you're here. Charles Sr. insisted on this dinner before the final paperwork." She smiled politely. "Of course. Happy to be here." The table was filled with polished laughter and clinking glasses. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns that whispered names like Milan and Paris. She nodded to each introduction. Charles Sr., tall and reserved, didn't bother standing. He extended a hand with rings heavier than sincerity. Amara shook it anyway. She was seated at the far end, not next to the hosts, but close enough to be seen. Not heard. Small talk buzzed around her like a swarm of soft stings. She endured it. The veiled questions, the veiled compliments. "You must be very good at what you do," said one woman in pearls, "to have built all that from nothing." "Must be the new wave," another chimed in. "Tech people are just so daring." Amara smiled. Always the same dance. They praised you for rising, as long as you didn't climb too high. The appetizers came, more wine, a toast from someone she hadn't been introduced to. Then, as the entrees arrived, Charles Jr. stood up, glass in hand. He was tall, trim, and devastatingly entitled. The kind of man who had always owned the room without ever earning it. "I'd like to welcome our guest," he began, grinning with teeth that didn't smile. "And thank her for joining us this evening." Murmurs of approval. A few nods. He continued, louder now. "Dinner wouldn't be complete without a bit of sparkle. Though, forgive me, when I walked in, I thought someone had let the help in early." Silence. Then, light, nervous chuckles. A few gasps. A woman covered her mouth, pretending she hadn't heard. Another shifted in her chair but said nothing. Amara froze, not from shock, but from memory. She'd heard it before. Different versions, same intent. She locked eyes with Charles Jr., her face unreadable. Then she placed her napkin on the table, stood slowly, and smiled. Not the smile of surrender, the smile of precision, the smile of a woman who had learned that silence, sometimes, is the loudest form of refusal. "I think I've lost my appetite," she said softly. And just like that, she turned and walked away, before dessert, before apologies, before they could decide how to spin the moment. The hallway outside the ballroom felt colder, quieter. Her heels clicked like punctuation marks down a marble sentence. A butler called after her softly, unsure whether to intervene. She didn't turn. In the car, she sat in silence. No tears, no rage, just the dull throb of an old wound reopened in a very expensive room. The driver asked, "Home, ma'am?" "Yes," she said, then paused. "Number. Take the long route." She needed air, and space, and time to think without the weight of etiquette choking her. Her phone buzzed. A message from her COO. "Heard the dinner went well. Can't wait to lock this in. You good?" She turned the screen off. She wasn't ready for business as usual. Somewhere behind her, crystal glasses were being refilled. Laughter had returned. Charles Jr. was probably already moving on to his next target. And Charles Sr., still seated, still silent. She realized no one had stepped in. Not even the ones who had smiled at her arrival. The ones who said they admired her journey. Not one of them had said, "That's not okay." And that told her everything. At home, the skyline stretched wide and indifferent. Her apartment on the 42nd floor was clean, minimalist. Success. Lived here. But tonight, even the silence felt sharp. She stood at the window, watching the city blink and breathe. What do you do? When the world invites you in, but only if you agree to leave parts of yourself at the door. Her life had been a collection of firsts. First black woman in her Ivy League MBA program. First under 35 CEO to lead a tech firm into the Fortune 100. First in her family to own a home, to fly private, to negotiate billion-dollar valuations. But first always came with conditions. Be brilliant, but not intimidating. Be proud, but never angry. Be exceptional, but never forget. You're an exception. She poured herself a glass of water, sat at the edge of the couch, and stared at the partnership documents on the coffee table. $500 million? The team had worked on this for months. There were jobs on the line, timelines, milestones. Her board would panic. Investors would question her judgment. But she knew. This wasn't about ego. It was about worth. Not what she was worth in the market, but what she was worth to herself. She picked up her phone and started drafting a statement. The next morning, the city moved as it always did, horns blaring, subways screeching, the skyline basking in cold ambition. But inside Amara's penthouse, time had slowed. She hadn't slept. The echo of Charles Jr.'s words still hummed in her ears like static. Did someone let the help in early? Not just the insult, but the room's response. Awkward chuckles, averted gazes, empty forks pausing midair, haunted her more than his voice. It was the silence that screamed the loudest. She stood barefoot in the kitchen, blazer from last night draped over a stool, her mind tracing invisible lines across the marble countertop. On the far side of the room, her laptop screen lit up with alerts. Investor, watchdog, tech queen Amara meets luxury kingpins. Buzz trade, Amara Bennett merger imminent after celebratory dinner. Internal memo, legal finalization due by Monday, 10 a.m. They didn't know. No one outside the ballroom knew what had happened. The world still believed she had smiled, toasted, celebrated. She closed the lid. The truth wasn't in those headlines. It was inside her chest, tightening, rising. She grabbed her phone and texted, "Emergency meeting. Board only. Noon." By noon, her boardroom was a mosaic of tension. Men and women in dark suits, eyes fixed on her like she was about to detonate something sacred. She stood at the head of the table, hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. "Before we get into projections," she said, "you should know, I walked out of the Harrow dinner last night. and I'm terminating the partnership." The room exploded into confused murmurs. Mark, her CFO, blinked as if she had spoken in another language. "You're… what?" "I said I'm walking away." A younger board member leaned forward. "Amara, respectfully, we've been building this deal for months. There are legal expectations, investor anticipation." "They insulted me," she said flatly, "in public, in a room full of powerful people, and no one spoke up." Dead silence. Finally, Nadine, the firm's general counsel, cleared her throat. "Was it actionable?" The question sat there, sharp and surgical. Was it actionable? Not inhuman, not degrading, but legally measurable? Amara looked around the table. Half of them couldn't meet her eyes. The other half looked at her like she was a liability now. Her jaw tightened. "No amount of money," she said, "can excuse humiliation. Not anymore." "But Amara, this isn't just about you," Mark began. "It is about me," she interrupted. "Because, if it can happen to me, in that room, with everything I've built, then what the hell does that mean for the people under us? What message do we send if we just sign anyway?" Nadine leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You realize this will create waves." "I'm counting on it." Later that afternoon, Amara sat alone in her office, lights dimmed. A single photo stood on her desk, her and her late father, on the day of her college graduation. He wore a suit too big and pride too wide. She touched the frame. He used to tell her, "When they try to shrink you, stand taller, even if your knees shake." She opened her laptop and began to write the press statement herself. No lawyers, no PR filters. Headline: "When dignity is denied, silence is complicity." Each word cut with calm precision. She wasn't attacking. She was choosing clarity. By 5 p.m., the company's comms director reviewed it and said nothing for 10 seconds straight. Are you sure?" Amara nodded. "Make it public. All channels. Tonight." When the statement dropped at 7:03 p.m., the world tilted. The tech world was stunned. Half of them didn't understand. The other half felt seen. "I am formally withdrawing from the Harrove partnership, effective immediately. I have built a company rooted in progress, not legacy. Respect is not a side note. It is the starting point." By midnight, her inbox was flooded. Some furious, some afraid, but most grateful. From a Black founder in Atlanta. "You just saved a generation of us from second-guessing our worth." From a young Latina engineer, "They've tried to make me shrink. Tonight, I remembered I don't have to." From a nameless intern, "Thank you for walking out." The internet buzzed louder by the hour. Twitter trended. Hashtag Amara walked Instagram flooded with quotes. LinkedIn turned corporate admiration into poetic eulogies. But inside Harrove House? Panic. 5 Charles Sr. was livid. Not because of his son's insult, but because of its consequences. "This is spiraling," he snapped in their private study, glass of bourbon untouched beside him. His PR team rushed to contain the fire. "We'll release a clarification. It was a misunderstanding. Humor taken out of context." "No!" Charles Sr. said sharply. "This isn't a joke anymore. Their CEO just walked away from $500 million and lit a match under our name." Charles Jr., slouched on a leather sofa, rolled his eyes. "So what?" "It'll pass. The market forgets." Charles Sr. turned to him, voice low and dangerous. "You are going to apologize. On camera. By morning." "But she's being dramatic." "No, you were being stupid." For the first time in his life, Charles Jr. looked small in his father's eyes. 6. But Amara? She wasn't watching. She was home, lights off, curtain drawn, lying in bed, eyes open. Her mother called, the only person who hadn't mentioned the deal once. "I saw your statement," she said, voice warm. "Your father would have been proud." Amara smiled into the darkness. "I'm tired, Mama." "You're not tired. You're finally free." She hadn't thought of it like that. Not yet. She'd just made the riskiest move of her career, walking away from money, influence, prestige. But what she kept was far rarer: self-respect. And she knew deep down, even if the world punished her for it, she would do it again. Tomorrow would bring headlines. But tonight, she let herself sleep. By dawn, the headlines were no longer about a merger. They were about a moment. Amara Bennett walks away from $500 million over disrespect. The cost of dignity. Tech CEO refuses to tolerate racism in elite circles. Charles Harrove Jr. sparks outrage after racist remark at business dinner. The clip arrived anonymously. A waiter, young, unseen, but sharp enough to record what the room wanted to forget, had quietly uploaded a 10-second video. The camera shook slightly as Charles Jr. lifted his champagne glass and laughed. Did someone let the help in early? It ended there, but it didn't need to continue. The internet handled the rest. In less than 2 hours, the video went viral. The audio was clear. The laughter that followed clearer. No one corrected him. No one objected. Not even Charles Sr. By 10 a.m., the Harrove crisis team was spiraling. The PR director paced back and forth. "We need a televised apology. Not a tweet, not a press release. Public, emotional, and immediate." Charles Sr. clenched his jaw. "Fine. Get the lighting. Prep the statement." But it was Charles Jr. who dragged his feet. "I'm not a villain," he muttered. "It was a joke." "No," his father snapped. "It was a torch, and you lit it in a room full of gasoline." That afternoon, Charles Jr. appeared on national television. Hair perfectly styled, face rehearsed. "I want to apologize to Ms. Bennett," he said, eyes glassy but emotionless. "What I said was insensitive and inappropriate. I respect her accomplishments and regret my words." The networks played it on loop, but the public wasn't buying it. Amara watched the clip once, then closed the tab. Her assistant peeked into her office. "The requests keep coming in. Every major network wants an exclusive." "I'm not interested." "Not even 60 Minutes?" She shook her head. "I've said what I needed to say." The assistant hesitated. "One more thing. We've had 12 partnership inquiries, 7 from international firms, 4 from U.S. startups, 1 from a social impact conglomerate." Amara looked up. "All of them led by CEOs who started from nothing. People who saw your speech and said, 'This is the kind of leadership we believe in.'" She nodded slowly. The irony wasn't lost on her. Walking away had created more value than signing ever could. Dignity, it turned out, wasn't just moral capital. It was economic, too. Across the city, universities hosted impromptu lectures on Amara's stand. Business professors assigned her press conference speech for class discussion. Ethics forums quoted her words like scripture. "When dignity is denied," she had said, "no amount of money can justify silence." On social media, the hashtag #RespectIsPriceless continued trending. Celebrities tweeted support. Authors wrote op-eds. Young professionals updated their LinkedIn statuses with, "Channeling my inner Amara Bennett." Thunderous applause. She walked out in a cream suit, simple and striking. No jewelry, no spectacle, just poise. The audience settled. Cameras clicked. She looked out at the sea of faces, young, old, diverse, hungry for change, and began. "I'm not here because I'm brave," she said. "I'm here because I was tired." Pause. Tired of choosing between success and self-respect. Tired of shrinking to make others comfortable. Tired of silence. She didn't name Charles. She didn't need to. But here's what I've learned, she continued. Respect isn't a perk. It's not a bonus. It's the currency we build trust with. And without trust, there's no leadership, only manipulation. Applause. You don't need to make a scene to make a stand. Sometimes you just need to walk away, quietly, completely, and without apology. Standing ovation. Her speech, The Cost of Dignity, became the most shared keynote of the year. After the summit, she returned to her hotel suite. Her phone buzzed with messages, world leaders, CEOs, activists. One message stood out. Unknown number. I was in that room the night of the dinner. I didn't speak up. I should have. I'm sorry. You changed the way I lead. Thank you. She stared at it. She would never know who it was, but maybe that was the point. Ripples didn't always return to the source. Sometimes they just kept going. That Friday, her company's team gathered in the atrium for an internal town hall. No suits, no scripts, just Amara and her people. She looked around at faces that trusted her, believed in her, watched her take a hit and come back stronger. Some of you were scared, she said. I understand that. But I want you to know, I didn't walk away from a deal. She paused. I walked toward our values. Applause erupted. Weeks turned into months. The Herovs never recovered their old glow. But Amara, she didn't just recover. She ascended. Not because she played the game, but because she changed the rules. Not by shouting, but by walking away. With grace, with power, and with her head high. The boardroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from order, the kind that came from fear. Every major executive of Amara Bennett's company was present. The walnut table stretched across the room like a battlefield, and at its head sat Amara, calm, focused, and unshakably composed. She placed her phone on the table, screen facing up. A reporter had just called it the most principled decision in corporate America this decade. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. I didn't call this meeting for congratulations, she said. I called it to realign our future. Her voice was clear, low, measured. We're not the same company we were 2 weeks ago. Hands shuffled papers. Board members glanced at one another. Michael Trent, CFO, and one of the longest-serving members leaned forward. Amara, we all admire your choice, but we have to ask, walking away from the Herove deal? What's the plan now? That deal would have increased our market valuation by 38%. Amara nodded. And destroyed the foundation we're trying to build. Silence. We don't build around money. We build around meaning. That's what makes the money sustainable. She tapped the folder in front of her. I've reviewed new proposals. 12 companies have reached out with offers. 7 of them align with our values. 3 more are in exploratory talks. A younger board member, Priya Das, chimed in. What's our filter now? What does alignment actually look like? Amara locked eyes with her. Respect, equity, transparency. If a company doesn't treat its lowest paid employee with dignity, I don't care how large their check is, we won't take it. The room stirred. They were used to numbers, not ethics. But Amara wasn't lecturing. She was leading. If we want to be the future, we can't partner with the past. Her chief of marketing, Leo, raised a cautious hand. But investors are still nervous. Some are questioning your decision as emotional, not strategic. Amara gave a slight smile. Let them. Emotionless leadership built the world we're trying to repair. She stood up slowly, walked to the wall-sized whiteboard. This isn't about one dinner or one insult, she continued. This is about culture, influence, power, and how we choose to use ours. Meanwhile, across the city, the Harrowby estate had become a war zone. Charles Sr. was reeling from another board member's resignation. Charles Jr. had officially been removed from day-to-day operations, and a luxury car brand had just pulled a multi-million-dollar collaboration with Harrow Motors. At a private meeting, Charles Sr. growled, "This isn't just PR, it's erosion. We're bleeding relevance." Their PR director laid it out flat. The public doesn't hate you because of one comment. They hate that no one in that room challenged it. He paused. Back at Amara's company, momentum was building. A short documentary about her story titled The Walk That Changed the Game debuted on YouTube and racked up over 10 million views in 3 days. In one scene, a woman in Detroit sat on her porch watching Amara's press conference on her phone. "That's how you know a woman knows her worth," she said to the camera. "She don't beg. She don't argue. She just walks." In another, a group of college students watched it in a leadership seminar. Their professor, wiping his glasses, said, "You all study finance. But don't forget, this is what value looks like in motion." By the end of the month, Amara finalized 2 new partnerships. One with a tech firm run by a former refugee from Sudan. The second with a Nordic AI company that had women in 70% of leadership positions. Both deals were smaller than the Harrow deal, but cleaner, sharper, stronger. At the signing ceremony, a journalist asked, "Do you regret turning down $500 million?" Amara didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Inside the boardroom once more, the team now worked with a new sense of identity. Presentations weren't just about growth. They were about mission. Recruiters didn't just search for skills. They searched for fit. Branding wasn't about slogans. It was about belief. Amara watched the transformation quietly. She didn't want a company that bowed to money. She wanted a company that defined what money would follow. One afternoon, she got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper. "I was one of them. That night, at that dinner, I laughed. I didn't mean to. It was fear, not malice. But I never forgot it. Your walk out woke something in me. I'm building differently now." No signature, just silence. But it moved her more than applause ever could. She folded it and kept it in her drawer. Months later, she was asked to guest lecture at Harvard Business School. The auditorium was full. She stood at the podium, calm and composed, and asked her opening question. "What would you do if your values cost you everything?" The students were silent. Then she added, "Now ask yourself this. What if they made you something greater than money ever could?" Amara never mentioned the Harrows by name again. She didn't need to. Her company's value soared, but more importantly, its culture crystallized. She had become a case study, a movement, a mirror, not just for business, but for leadership with a soul. And far away, behind the stone gates of their estate, the Harrows watched their kingdom shrink, watched the world choose grace over grandeur, and realized they didn't lose to a woman. They lost to her dignity. Back at Amara's company, momentum was building. A short documentary about her story titled The Walk That Changed the Game debuted on YouTube and racked up over 10 million views in 3 days. In one scene, a woman in Detroit sat on her porch watching Amara's press conference on her phone. "That's how you know a woman knows her worth," she said to the camera. "She don't beg. She don't argue. She just walks." In another, a group of college students watched it in a leadership seminar. Their professor, wiping his glasses, said, "You all study finance. But don't forget, this, this is what value looks like in motion. By the end of the month, Amara finalized 2 new partnerships, one with a tech firm run by a former refugee from Sudan, the second with a Nordic AI company that had women in 70% of leadership positions. Both deals were smaller than the Harov deal, but cleaner, sharper, stronger. At the signing ceremony, a journalist asked, "Do you regret turning down $500 million?" Amara didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Inside the boardroom once more, the team now worked with a new sense of identity. Presentations weren't just about growth. They were about mission. Recruiters didn't just search for skills. They searched for fit. Branding wasn't about slogans. It was about belief. Amara watched the transformation quietly. She didn't want a company that bowed to money. She wanted a company that defined what money would follow. One afternoon, she got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper. I was one of them. That night. At that dinner. I laughed. I didn't mean to. It was fear, not malice. But I never forgot it. Your walkout woke something in me. I'm building differently now. No signature. Just silence. But it moved her more than applause ever could. She folded it and kept it in her drawer. Months later, she was asked to guest lecture at Harvard Business School. The auditorium was full. She stood at the podium, calm and composed, and asked her opening question. What would you do if your values cost you everything? The students were silent. Then she added, Now ask yourself this. What if they made you something great? And belief, Amara realized, was the loudest kind of echo. She paused at the company's mission statement printed on the wall, something she had rewritten months ago. We lead with courage, build with equity, and speak even when the room goes quiet. This wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever walked out of a room where they weren't welcomed and chose not to turn back. And though the noise would eventually fade, the echo, Amara's echo, would live on in the rooms that finally learned to listen. In the months that followed, something subtle yet profound began to happen. Rooms started to remember. Not in the poetic sense, not as symbolism, but literally. Conversations, decisions, and policies started being reshaped by the memory of Amara Bennett's refusal. Across the corporate world, boardrooms whispered her name. She wasn't just a cautionary tale or a bold exception. She had become a mirror, reflecting the truth of what leadership looked like when it chose conscience over convenience. One of those rooms belonged to a Fortune 100 firm that had once declined to partner with Amara's company, citing cultural alignment issues. Now, that same firm was reaching out with a revised proposal, not just to collaborate, but to listen. Amara didn't rush her response. She had learned not all remorse is rooted in growth. Some of it is just damage control. So, before a single meeting was booked, she sent them a question. What have you changed since the last time we spoke? Their silence lasted 3 days. On the 4th, she received a document outlining internal restructurings, leadership training programs, and an apology letter. Not from legal, but from the CEO himself. She agreed to the meeting, not the deal, just the meeting. Elsewhere, Harvard Business Review published an op-ed titled The Bennett Principle, When Walking Away Moves the Market. It detailed how her departure had catalyzed a cultural audit in several blue-chip companies. The phrase Bennett Standard began circulating in executive coaching circles, referring to a leader's ability to prioritize values without sacrificing vision. Inside Amara's office, the changes were even more personal. A once reticent engineer, Brielle, spoke up during a product design meeting and questioned the accessibility standards of a new prototype. The room paused, surprised. Then someone else backed her up. Then another. By the end of the week, the entire design framework was being revisited through a more inclusive lens. Later that evening, Brielle emailed Amara one line. "I thought my voice would cost me. Turns out it created space." Amara replied, "That's what voice is for." Meanwhile, Charles Harrove Jr. remained out of sight. Since being suspended, he had disappeared from the public eye. But the consequences hadn't disappeared with him. A shareholder lawsuit had been filed. A luxury hospitality chain terminated its multi-property partnership with the Harroves. Their foundation gala, once the jewel of high society, was cancelled due to reputational challenges. In one particularly scathing editorial, a journalist wrote, "The Harroves built their empire on inherited wealth. Amara Bennett built hers on inherited pain. Only one of them was prepared for real leadership." Amara didn't celebrate the downfall. She didn't repost the articles. She focused on building forward. She hosted her company's first leadership retreat in the countryside. No tech, no pitches, no branding, just people. Conversations unfolded around bonfires, under stars, and during long walks through the woods. They talked about the kind of power that doesn't dominate, but liberates. It wasn't typical executive development, but it changed people. One young leader from HR approached Amara at sunrise on the final day and said, "This was the first time I've ever been asked who I am, outside of what I do." Amara smiled. "That's the only version of you that should lead." Back in the city, Amara found herself nominated for multiple awards: Entrepreneur of the Year, Disruptor in Leadership, Woman of the Decade. Some she accepted. Others she declined. She didn't need trophies. She needed ripple effects. One evening, she received a call from a university president inviting her to co-create a course on ethical leadership. It wouldn't be theory-based. It would be lived experience-based. Case studies, failures, lines drawn, and most importantly, voices rarely heard in textbooks. She agreed, but on one condition. The course must be open access, no tuition, no barrier. The university hesitated, then relented. The course launched with over 120,000 global enrollees in the first 2 weeks. A young woman from Nairobi wrote in the discussion forum, "This isn't a course, it's a compass." Amara read the comment late at night, under the glow of a desk lamp. She thought about her younger self, polishing her resume, silencing her voice in rooms she was just grateful to be in. That girl wouldn't have believed this future. She leaned back in her chair, not with pride, but with resolve. The world was changing, not fast, not cleanly, but changing nonetheless. And everywhere she went now, she noticed it. In how a CEO referred to interns by name. In how a board member publicly stepped down, citing a need to create space for those better equipped to lead this moment. In how a teenage girl introduced herself at a conference by saying, "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to build what they said we couldn't." These weren't coincidences. These were echoes. Rooms that once dismissed her were now studying her. Institutions that once resisted were now reshaping themselves. And while her name might fade from headlines in time, the standard she set wouldn't. Because once a room learns to remember who had the courage to walk away, it never forgets how silence was shattered. The new headquarters wasn't in a skyline tower or nestled behind tinted glass and manicured hedges. It stood in the heart of the city's industrial quarter, in what used to be an old textile mill. Brick walls weathered with time, high windows flooded with natural light, and the echoes of labor still etched into the beams. Amara chose it deliberately. She didn't want to build an empire that towered over people. She wanted one that stood among them. The renovation was modest, but intentional. No executive suites, no locked doors. Desks were arranged in open clusters. Meeting rooms had names like Integrity, Resilience, and Legacy. The cafeteria served dishes based on recipes submitted by employees' families. A mural, painted by a local artist, stretched across the east wall, depicting the journey of a woman walking through fire, rising with each step. The grand opening drew attention, not for its glamour, but for its message. Power, when shared, becomes purpose. Amara addressed the small crowd gathered outside under a cloudy sky. "This isn't just a building," she said. "It's a blueprint for how we lead now, not from a pedestal, but from presence." Her voice was calm, unwavering, even as cameras flashed and reporters leaned forward to catch every word. She wasn't performing. She was planting. Inside, the real work began. Teams that had once worked in silos now operated cross-functionally. The product development team included voices from marketing, accessibility consultants, and even part-time interns. When they created a new communication platform aimed at low-income communities, Amara asked one question: "Would my mother have found this useful?" It became a measuring stick for every feature moving forward. But rebuilding wasn't just about structure. It was about scars. There were still moments when the memory of that ballroom resurfaced. The laughter, the stillness, the shame. It would flash across her mind during interviews, at quiet dinners, or even while waiting for an elevator. But instead of shrinking from it, Amara began to speak of it more openly. Not as a wound, but as a warning. She gave a talk at Stanford's business school titled "Dignity Isn't Disruptive, It's Directional." In it, she dismantled the myth that professionalism meant suppression. She spoke about microaggressions that go unchallenged, about tone policing, about the fatigue of being the only one in a room that claims to be inclusive. Afterward, a professor in tears told her that was the first time someone named the invisible cost of pretending. Meanwhile, the Harovs were still reeling. Their flagship brand, long synonymous with elegance, was under federal review for discriminatory hiring practices. More damaging than lawsuits was the cultural shift. Consumers no longer accepted apologies without action. Their stores saw record-low foot traffic. Influencers who once endorsed their products now distanced themselves with carefully worded statements. The empire hadn't crumbled, but it had cracked. Back in her new headquarters, Amara sat across from a young software engineer named Malik, who had asked for a one-on-one. He was nervous, shifting in his seat. Then, finally, he said, "I'm the first person in my family to graduate college. I thought I had to hide where I come from to survive here." Amara leaned forward. "Tell me something, Malik. Have you ever built anything that lasted by hiding the foundation?" He blinked, then shook his head. "Exactly," she smiled. "Your story is your strength. Bring it into the room." That became her unofficial motto. In the weeks that followed, the company launched a story-first initiative, where every new hire introduced themselves with a 5-minute narrative. Not about their resume, but about who they were. Immigrant journeys, single-parent households, war zones, rural farms, undocumented childhoods, it all surfaced. And with it came something corporate culture rarely fosters: humanity. Amara knew rebuilding across the industry. So, she did something few CEOs dared to do. She opened her company's internal policies to the public. Hiring matrices, salary brackets, parental leave practices, DEI progress, all made fully transparent. Critics said it was risky. Competitors might copy her framework. Investors might question the exposure. She welcomed both. Let them copy, she told her board. Let them question. That's the point. And slowly, others did follow. A tech giant based in Singapore adopted her transparency model. A Scandinavian VC firm restructured its portfolio based on ethical alignment. Even a rival company, once dismissive of her methods, requested a private tour of her HQ. But Amara didn't stop there. She created a fellowship for underrepresented founders. No pitch decks, no suits, just vision. Each selected fellow received seed funding, mentorship, and one unshakable promise: you belong here. Applications poured in from over 40 countries. One applicant wrote, "I've never walked into a room without feeling like I had to explain myself. Thank you for building a room that explains itself instead." The rebuild wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was steady, deliberate. It was 1,000 small choices that, together, became a revolution. And when Amara stood alone at dusk in that old mill-turned HQ, watching her team wrap up for the day, laughing, challenging, creating, she didn't see the company she had saved. She saw the future she had authored. A future where dignity didn't come at the cost of success. Where walking away once didn't mean walking alone forever. Where the rooms that remembered had become rooms that rebuilt. The new headquarters wasn't nestled in a glittering business district or surrounded by mirrored towers. Instead, it stood quietly in the heart of the city's industrial quarter. Once a dusty textile mill, now reborn. Exposed brick walls bore the weight of history. High-arched windows welcomed the morning sun, and wooden beams whispered of labor, resilience, and time. Amara had chosen it for a reason. She didn't want a palace. She wanted a place rooted in reality, accessible, open, and full of possibility. The renovation reflected her vision. There were no executive suites, no tinted glass conference rooms removed from the energy of the floor. Desks were arranged in collaborative clusters. Every floor had open lounges where titles were left at the door. Meeting rooms were named not after numbers, but values. Integrity, voice, courage, rebuild. In the main lobby, a local artist painted a bold mural. A woman stepping through flame, rising taller with every stride, her silhouette stitched with the faces of those who walked before her. At the building's dedication, Amara stood at a simple podium in front of a modest crowd of staff, community members, and press. "This building," she said, "isn't about square footage or skyline views. It's about what we build inside it and who we become in the process." Cameras flashed. Some reporters expected a grand reveal of tech innovations or a dramatic pivot in strategy. But Amara's revolution wasn't about code or contracts. It was about culture. Inside, the work began. Cross-functional teams replaced rigid departments. Product designers collaborated directly with accessibility consultants, part-time interns, and even users from underrepresented communities. Every prototype passed through one critical lens. Would my mother find this useful? Amara asked her team again and again. Would my niece? My grandmother? If the answer was hesitation, they started again. But rebuilding wasn't just external. It was deeply personal. Amara still carried the memory of that ballroom, not as a scar, but as a lesson. There were nights when she sat in her office alone, recalling the smug laughter, the silence that followed, the sharp edge of humiliation. It was no longer a wound, but it wasn't something she forgot. And she didn't want to. She began speaking more openly about that night. Not for pity, but for perspective. In keynotes, interviews, and intimate staff meetings, she shared not just the event, but the aftermath, the mental toll, the decisions behind the silence, the cost of choosing dignity over dollars. Her honesty changed things. At a leadership offsite, a junior engineer named Malik nervously approached her after a group session. "I've always been afraid," he said, eyes lowered. "Afraid that if I told people where I'm really from, they'd see me as less." Amara placed a hand over her heart and replied, "If you're hiding your roots, you're cutting your own wings. What you carry is exactly what we need." That moment sparked something. Soon after, the company launched an internal program called Origin Stories. Every new hire, instead of giving a resume pitch, was invited to share a 5-minute story about their life. Not credentials, but context. Some spoke of growing up in refugee camps. Others shared stories of caregiving, loss, immigration, survival. It became a ritual, and with it, walls dissolved. Colleagues began seeing each other not as job titles, but as whole humans. Meanwhile, the Harroves continued to sink. Their once immaculate luxury brand was under scrutiny. Lawsuits emerged, investors withdrew, public relations campaigns flopped, their words ringing hollow without action. Charles Jr. remained in seclusion. Charles Sr. tried charm offensives, but the damage was done. Consumers had shifted, culture had evolved, and Amara was no longer interested in looking back. One afternoon, she sat in a meeting with her board, reviewing a bold proposal. It wasn't a tech innovation. It was a transparency initiative. She wanted to publish her company's internal policies for the world to see. Salary bands, promotion criteria, leadership demographics, and DEI progress, all in plain sight. The room was tense. "This could backfire," one board member warned. "What if it invites criticism?" Amara smiled. "Then it's working." And so they did it. The policy page launched with the tagline, "Accountability is our competitive advantage." The response? Overwhelming. Other companies reached out, requesting templates. Nonprofits adapted the model. MBA students cited it in case studies. A think tank in Berlin called it one of the boldest integrity moves in modern corporate history. Still, Amara remained grounded. She didn't do press junkets. She didn't throw parties. Instead, she launched a new initiative, the Founders Forward Fellowship. It was designed for early-stage entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. No pitch decks, no expensive application fees. Just a short letter. What do you want to build, and why? From over 12,000 applicants, her team selected 10. One letter read, "My mother braided hair for 17 hours a day, so I could code in a public library. I want to build a platform that pays women like her what they deserve." Another said, "I've been homeless 3 times. My idea is simple. Create a job board that filters by dignity, not just salary." Amara met with each fellow personally. "You're not here to impress anyone," she told them. "You're here to build what they said you couldn't." And they did. The rebuild wasn't perfect. There were setbacks. A product launch that flopped. A hiring manager who was quietly gatekeeping. An investor who tried to push outdated metrics. But Amara faced each moment with the same clarity she showed at that podium months ago. This wasn't about perfection. It was about staying in alignment. One night, she walked alone through the HQ, past the mural glowing faintly in the low light. Her hand brushed the painted edge of the woman rising through flame. She thought about how far she'd come. Not in wealth, but in worth. She had turned a moment of public humiliation into a movement of private reckoning across industries. She had built something not just scalable, but soulful. And most of all, she had proven that walking away doesn't mean you're walking alone. It often means you're walking first. Rain traced lazy patterns down the glass walls as Amara Bennett entered the meeting room named Resilience. Her core leadership team followed, silent, alert. On the polished table sat a stack of sealed folders, and on the digital screen, a single logo glowed in quiet contradiction: Harrove International. No alias, no shell firm, no disguises. The counteroffer was real. Months had passed since the infamous ballroom incident, the smirk, the insult, the silence that followed, and Amara's historic decision to walk away from a $500 million deal. Her walkout had shaken boardrooms around the world, but now, here they were, returning not just with an apology, but with something much bigger. A formal letter, signed by Charles Harrove Sr. himself, detailed the proposal. We are offering Amara Bennett full autonomy to launch an independent, self-governed division under our corporate umbrella. You choose the name, the vision, the team. You set the terms. We provide full funding, $700 million in seed capital. Silence clung to the room like static. Her COO, Latrice, was the first to speak. This is bold. It's desperate, said Jamal, head of product. They're hemorrhaging relevance. You were their only shot at credibility. Amara remained still. The room pulsed with tension. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same empire that had once laughed her out of a ballroom was now asking her to lead part of it. On her terms. With their money. The offer had landed with precision. It wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. They weren't offering partnership. They were offering surrender. Still, Amara didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked for the room. Once alone, she turned to the window, the city below hazy with rain. Her reflection stared back. Older, sharper, quieter than before. Her fingers tapped the edge of the table as she replayed it all in her mind. The smirk. Zrenia Rishania. She knew what this was. A test not of business, but of boundaries. That night, in her apartment high above the skyline, she received an unexpected call. It was from Charles Harrove Sr. Ms. Bennett, his voice crackled through the line, weary but measured. I know this is, complicated. Is it? She said coolly. I want to apologize. Again. Not just for what was said, but for what we allowed. For who we allowed to speak for us. You didn't just allow it, Amara replied. You watched it. A pause. He sighed. That's fair. What do you want from me, Charles? He hesitated. I want to build something better, and I can't do it without people like you. No, Amara said. You shouldn't do it without people like me. There's a difference. Another pause. We're dying, he admitted. We have the infrastructure, but we've lost the heart. You can bring that back. And what's in it for me? Legacy, he said simply. True legacy. Amara almost laughed. The next morning, she convened her team again. She laid out the facts, the money, the power, the independence. No strings, at least on paper. Then she asked a question that startled them. What if we said yes? Latrice raised an eyebrow. Seriously? Not for them, Amara said. For us. For the people we couldn't reach before. What if we used their platform to rewrite the entire narrative, on our terms? The room buzzed. Tension shifted to possibility. Jamal leaned forward. You're saying, hijack the empire from inside? Amara didn't smile. Number, I'm saying rebuild it, brick by brick, with our fingerprints on every stone. They debated for hours. Legal risk, ethical optics, cultural contamination. Could they trust an institution that had once silenced them? Could a system be changed from within, without being changed by it? Finally, Amara said, There's another option. She slid a folder across the table. Inside, an outline for a new foundation, independent of any corporation, fully funded through a coalition of allies, philanthropists, ethical VCs, global partners who'd quietly approached since her walkout. No compromise, no counteroffer, just complete control. And just like that, the Harrove proposal became irrelevant. 2 days later, Amara stood before a private boardroom at Harrove HQ, not to negotiate, but to decline. Charles Sr. and a group of executives sat stiffly as she entered. "Thank you for the offer," she began. "It's generous, it's ambitious, and it's late." Charles blinked. "Late? I don't need your legacy," she said gently. "I'm building my own." She handed him a folder, detailing her new foundation, the Bennett Institute for Ethical Innovation. "Your money can't buy my voice," she continued, "but if you want to fund scholarships, sponsor open-source equity tools, or contribute to global leadership fellowships, you're welcome to apply, like everyone else." Stunned silence. Amara turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "One more thing," she said without turning. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you lift up while you're still here." Then she walked out. That evening, the press caught wind of it. Again. Bennett rejects $700 million Harrove counteroffer. Amara's vision expands beyond corporations. The woman who said no again. On social media, young founders, activists, and professionals quoted her speech. Investors followed the momentum. Within a week, her new foundation raised $200 million in ethical commitments. But for Amara, the most powerful moment came in a quiet email. Subject line, "Thank you." Body. "I used to think saying no meant shutting a door. Watching you taught me it means building a better one." She read it twice, then smiled. She had turned them down not from ego, but from evolution. And in doing so, she proved, again, that real power doesn't come from the offer. It comes from the ability to walk away from it. The morning sun spilled across the polished floors of the Bennett Institute's new headquarters, an open, light-filled space in the heart of San Francisco, where innovation didn't just happen in labs, but in ideas. Amara Bennett walked through the atrium, heels echoing softly as staff lifted their heads to greet her with pride, not fear. There were no ivory towers here, just minds, wide open, and doors never closed. Since launching the Institute, the response had been overwhelming. Applications poured in, engineers from underrepresented communities, policymakers tired of bureaucracy, teen inventors from overlooked schools. The ethos was clear. No gatekeeping, just growth. But the pressure was mounting. A wave of corporate backlash had begun to churn. Quietly at first, then louder. Think pieces in major outlets criticized her move as emotional leadership. Anonymous sources called her difficult. One investor publicly asked whether she'd survive without institutional guardrails. They weren't just questioning her, they were challenging her presence in the arena she now ruled. That week, her assistant Layla stepped into her office with a newspaper headline printed in bold, "Can morality be scaled? Experts doubt Bennett's model can last." Amara looked at it for a long time, then folded it without a word. Meanwhile, at Harrove International, things were unraveling. Charles Jr. had quietly returned, not to the board, but as a strategic advisor. The public still hadn't forgiven him. Investors were jittery. And worse, the company's latest product, a luxury smart home line, had tanked, accused of privacy violations and tone-deaf branding. Charles Sr., thinner and wearier, called an emergency meeting. He stared at the board, then muttered, "We underestimated the storm she carried." One executive asked, Should we consider merging with her institute? Another snapped, she doesn't need us. We need her. They all knew it. And yet none of them said what they feared most. They had become irrelevant. Back at the Bennett Institute, Amara stood in front of a group of 20 young fellows, each one selected for brilliance, grit, and vision. She had chosen them herself. Today, she told them, you don't just learn how to lead a company. You learn how to lead yourself. One hand rose, a girl named Kenza, just 19. Ms. Bennett, how do you know when you're doing the right thing, when so many voices tell you otherwise? Amara didn't answer right away. She thought of the ballroom, the silence, the apology that never came, the offer that did. She thought of what it cost to say no, not just in money, but in comfort, in peace. Finally, she said, if the voices are louder than your values, you're listening to the wrong noise. Kenza nodded slowly, the room hanging on every word. Then came the storm. A whistleblower leaked documents showing that a rival tech conglomerate, one of Amara's former suitors, had launched a smear campaign against the Institute. False reports, social media manipulation, backdoor pressure on donors. It was an orchestrated takedown. The goal, discredit Amara, destabilize the Institute, and remind the world that idealism had limits. Her board panicked. Partners got cold feet. Anonymous threats started flooding the office email. That night, Amara sat alone in her rooftop garden. The city pulsed below. For the first time in months, she felt the weight, not of failure, but of their fear. They feared what she represented. A world where you didn't have to play their game to win. Her phone buzzed. It was Latrice. You okay? She asked. Amara stared at the skyline. They're coming harder now. That's how you know it's working. A silence passed. Amara, Latrice added softly, whatever you do next, don't shrink. Amara didn't. 3 days later, she called a global live stream. No press release, no press filters, just Amara, a camera, a message. She wore a simple black blouse. No branding, no polish, just truth. There are forces trying to convince you that ethics are weak, that values are naive, and that power should only exist in rooms most of us will never enter. They are wrong. The future doesn't belong to the loudest or the richest. It belongs to the most principled. And if they fear that, they should. Because we're not here to knock on closed doors anymore. We're building new ones. The video went viral. Not viral, volcanic. Within hours, messages poured in. Educators, young entrepreneurs, single mothers, retired activists, even disillusioned executives. A billionaire in Singapore donated $10 million anonymously. A group of artists from Brooklyn launched a street art campaign called Lead Like Amara. A Harvard ethics professor announced he was stepping down to teach full-time at the Institute. Suddenly, the tide wasn't turning. It was rising. At Harrove HQ, the boardroom sat in silence, watching the live stream in full. Charles Jr. finally said, "We underestimated her. Twice." Charles Sr. looked tired. "No," he said quietly. "We tried to silence her, and she answered with something we forgot how to use. Dignity." Back in San Francisco, Amara stood in front of her team once more. They were weary, but renewed. The attacks hadn't broken them. They had clarified them. "We don't fight fire with fire," she told them. "We build rain." Outside, it had started to drizzle again. Gentle, defiant, steady. The auditorium buzzed with quiet energy. Hundreds of seats filled with students, founders, policymakers, and visionaries from around the world. Flags from dozens of countries hung overhead. The backdrop read, "Global Summit on Ethical Leadership." Keynote speaker, Amara Bennett. It was the moment no one had imagined a year ago. Not even her. Not when she'd walked out of that grand ballroom. Not when she'd rejected the Harrows twice. And certainly not when the smear campaigns had tried to end her rise before it began. But here she was. Amara stepped onto the stage in an elegant white pantsuit. The room fell silent. There were no teleprompters, no handlers, just her and the truth. She began not with applause, but with a memory. A year ago, I stood in a room full of wealth and power, and I was laughed at. Not because I lacked credentials or accomplishments, but because I didn't fit the mold of who they thought power should look like. I walked out that night, with no deal, no applause, and no guarantee of what would come next. But I had one thing that never left me: my values. The room leaned in. People said walking away was emotional, that I was reckless, that I'd ruined an empire. But here's the truth. Empires built on silence eventually crumble under the weight of truth. And today, we're not just here to talk about the future. We're here to build it. Her words were broadcast across 60 countries, translated live, clipped by news anchors, posted by teens on TikTok, cited by CEOs. It became the most watched keynote in the summit's history. But Amara didn't linger in that spotlight. That same week, the Bennett Institute announced its next bold initiative, a global equity fund, $1 billion aimed at funding women, BIPOC, and underrepresented founders across 5 continents. Not just tech, not just business, science, education, public policy, article community wellness, prison reform. The legacy wasn't about her anymore. It was about who came next. Meanwhile, the Harrows quietly restructured. Charles Jr. resigned permanently. Charles Sr. withdrew from public life. The family business survived, barely, but its relevance shrank to whispers. Their empire hadn't collapsed overnight. It had dissolved piece by piece in the shadow of a woman they once dismissed as the help. One evening, Amara visited her childhood neighborhood. No entourage, no headlines, just her, walking past the corner store where she used to buy ice pops, the rusted bus stop bench where she'd studied for exams, the brick wall she'd once been told was as far as a girl like her could ever reach. She placed her hand on it. It didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like the foundation. A week later, Amara stood at a modest groundbreaking ceremony for the Institute's newest satellite campus, in Lagos, Nigeria. The land once held nothing but dry soil and promise. Now it would house classrooms, labs, mentorship hubs, and studios. Her mother, who had flown in from Atlanta, stood by her side in tears. "Do you remember when they said you were too proud?" her mother asked softly. Amara smiled. "I was never proud. I was just unwilling to bow." Later, she received a handwritten letter. No return address, just a short note. "I don't know if you remember me. I was at the ballroom. I said nothing. I laughed because everyone else did. You taught me more in your silence than any deal ever could. I'm sorry. I'm trying to be better." "Thank you." She read it twice, then tucked it into the pages of her journal. She didn't need revenge. She had something much rarer: impact. At the Institute's first graduation ceremony, she stood before the inaugural class, bright-eyed, braver than ever. Some would start companies. Some would write policies. Some would simply speak up in rooms that had never welcomed them before. And that would be enough. She closed her speech with words they would never forget. "You are not here to fit in. You are here to redefine what belongs." When history looked back on Amara Bennett, it wouldn't just remember the walkout. It would remember the walk forward. The institutions she challenged. The people she lifted. The dignity she never negotiated. She didn't just lead a movement. She became the reason others believed they could start their own.